If you caught me on my last video, you saw that I unboxed a GoPro Hero 13 and then took it with me on a local dive to see how well suited it was for underwater use. Today, we're going to look at the Hero 13's arch nemesis, the DJI Action 5 Pro, where we're going to look at some of its physical features before heading back to our local spring to get some sample footage to see how well this camera is suited for diving and underwater filming. As always, we'll be looking at this camera's lens options, color profiles, and even get a feel for how well this little camera may fit into your next dive trip. Before we move forward, I do want to mention that in no way am I affiliated with DJI, and this video is not sponsored. So now let's get started by first getting this camera out of its box. So here it is in the flesh, the DJI Action 5 Pro. Just like its predecessor, it does have the same magnetic mounting systems where it'll attach right here on the bottom and on the side as well. These mounting systems are really useful for diving because you can not only keep it mounted to the top of your dive mask, but it allows you to easily detach it from that mask without having to completely undo those old school thumb screws. You can see that these mounts will attach to the bottom of the camera, but they also attach to the side of the camera as well. That way you can shoot your vertical video just in case that's the sort of thing that you're into. In case you're worried about the magnets not being strong enough, keep in mind that there's also a latching system that's involved here as well. It's where you can push down on both sides of the latch, causing it to release. That way you can have the peace of mind that you're not going to lose your camera at some point in your dive. So those are the magnetic mounts, but moving on to the cage. This cage will of course protect your camera for any bumps, bruises, or any sort of trauma that you may subject it to at any point throughout your dive. When the cage is on, you can still access the charging port through this hatch over here on the side. And then if you wanted to access the battery hatch or the SD card, you will have to take it outside of the cage. In addition to the cage, there's also a rubber bumper on the outside edge of this lens for additional protection. One thing that I did notice about the Action 4 is that the battery hatch did come open way too easy, which is kind of a scary thing when it comes to taking these things underwater. But I did notice on the Action 5 Pro, it takes a lot more force to push this door open, which means that you may be able to safely dive with this camera without the use of the cage, if that's what you want to do. Once you open up the side door, you can see that the battery comes right out of the side, and you can see that the SD card slot is going to be sitting right next to it. Now, just in case you show up without your SD card, this camera has a built-in hard drive that's 65 gigabytes in size. This is a useful and exciting feature, and I'm really glad that they included this. And let's not forget the sensor, which is 1/1.3 inches, and it boasts 13.5 stops of dynamic range, whatever that means. The battery itself is actually pretty impressive. DJI claims that it has a 4-hour runtime, which I'm a little skeptical about. I would imagine that this 4-hour runtime is certainly going to depend on the settings. Turning this camera on is pretty standard stuff. The power button is right over here on the side of the camera, and it also allows you to change through different settings and profiles while in use. And of course, the record button is going to be in the top right part of the camera body. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this, but this is something that I'm really interested in trying out. Is apparently there's a depth gauge that's built into this camera, so if you're diving without the underwater housing, it'll actually show you how deep you are just by looking at the back display screen on your camera. Like I said, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I'm really excited to get this camera in the water and try it out. So now let's head back to my local spring to not only see how well the depth gauge works, but also take a look at the different lens options, color profiles, and of course, in my opinion, the most important part, how well does the auto white balance perform underwater? So enough talking, let's take this camera on a dive. As I mentioned earlier, this camera does have a built-in depth gauge, and I was excited to try it out, so I chose to dive without the underwater housing. Here you can see that the depth is going to be displayed very clearly on the left side of the display screen. When doing so, keep in mind not to exceed the camera's depth limit of 60 feet. You might be wondering what's going on here. My dive buddy is taking a look into a tiny spring-fed cave entrance that's known as Deep Hole. It's much too small for anyone to fit into, but you certainly can't blame him for trying. All of the clips that you've seen so far have been shot in 4K 60, slowed down to 50%, and also use Rocksteady Plus, which is DJI's built-in stabilization software. The three options that are available are going to be Rocksteady, Rocksteady Plus, and then Horizon Balancing, which can only be used with the standard lens mode. This is what Rocksteady Plus looks like when the footage is not slowed down and it's shown in real time. Now let's head underneath this old dock. This way we can put ourselves in a somewhat dark environment where there's still plenty of ambient light. Under here we'll not only be able to test out the dynamic range, but also see how well the auto white balance reacts to this type of environment. Looking at this clip, I am able to appreciate the dynamic range that you can see in this shot. However, the white balance does seem to be shifting pretty radically from warm to cool. Looking at the different lens options, this is going to be standard D-Warp. This is going to be wide. And this is going to be ultra wide. Now, it could just be me, but I'm not noticing too much of a difference between the three options. I'm also not noticing a whole lot of distortion either, so maybe this is a good thing. And at this point, I'm thinking that ultra wide will be my preferred lens option. Keep in mind, if you plan on adding in additional stabilization in post that'll result in an additional crop, shooting in ultra wide will give you that extra wiggle room. Now moving on to the different color profiles. You may have noticed DJI's HLG profile, which is very similar to GoPro's HDR profile. This is nothing more than a color profile that's designed to boost dynamic range. And this, of course, is the standard color profile, which is also in 10-bit. This is DJI's log profile, known as D-Log, and this is going to require color grading and post-processing. But with this option, you can have the most dynamic range and the best results possible. This is what D-Log looks like after I applied my own LUT to it. If you feel like it looks ugly, that may just be due to my color grading skills. Now let's talk about some of the slow motion features that are included on this camera. You do have the ability to shoot at 240 frames a second, but unfortunately, you do have to down-res to 1080p in order to shoot in this frame rate. For this reason, you may want to just shoot at 120 frames a second, which allows you to shoot in 4K. And of course, for your viewing pleasure, as we wrap this video up, here's some footage shot in 4K 60, slowed down to 50%. Thanks for hanging out this long, but most importantly, I hope that you found this video useful. As always, I'll see you in the next dive. Thanks for watching.